Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, South Africa's largest biz news website. And we are indeed living in interesting times, as the old Chinese curse goes. Following the global financial crisis, we see trust in the financial system has waned, spawning political movements that have birthed the likes of Trump and Brexit, and delivering shots across the bows of the established financial system in the form of cryptocurrencies. And while governments and central banks debate how to best regulate the system, which by its very nature resists central oversight, I think what should be of very concern to everyone is that there exists interest from ordinary people in creating a world where there is no trust at all. Well, that was certainly one of the key messages that came from the authors of a fascinating page-turner of a new book entitled The End of Money, The Great Erosion of Trust in Banking, China's Minsky Moment and the Fallacy of Cryptocurrency. And it's a great pleasure to join one of the co-authors, in fact, the lead author on the book, David Buckham, CEO of Monocle. David, love the title, by the way, and very quickly you get into why it's called that, because of Francis Fukuyama's calling the end of history at the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm assuming here, but it really wasn't the end of history, and I don't think it's quite the end of money just yet. But it's a fascinating read. Let's just start at the beginning. What? Tell us a little bit more about your background, firstly. But what was the inspiration for the book?
Okay, so thank you very much, Michael, for having us. Basically, I worked in banking and investment banking in the late 1990s, and I worked for a bank in South Africa that failed in the A2 banking crisis. And one day we were running, and not quite, but after the Sambo crisis. And I then went on to work for some technology firms. I started Monocle in 2002. And I read the Basel Accord before it was made law, and that was my inspiration to fly around the world and offer management consulting services to banks to implement these really technical rules. I have a degree in mathematics and a master's in English, so it felt like it was a good combo to go. And we consulted in Iceland, in Denmark, for a bank in Denmark called Veoneer Bank that was over 100 years old, for Landsbanken in Iceland, for a bank in Hong Kong, one of the top local Hong Kong banks, and we were pretty much around the world implementing a set of rules that were supposed to be global, and was part of the great aspiration of post-war Europe, which was this shall never occur again. We're going to create the United Nations, and and part of that was the BCBS, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. So I just had like a first-hand view of banks, one after the next, failing in front of my eyes. So Landsbanken, complete failure. Everyone I worked with, Veoneer Bank, complete failure. One day they couldn't make
and back then, Basel was a couple of, maybe 20 pages, and the various Basel Accords just grew and grew and grew and became more complex, complicated, and the failures didn't stop.
Correct. As the system continued to fail, the mathematics became more complex. The requirements from Basel became more technocratic, and then when the financial crisis hit, and it was surreal to me that when you understand the numbers, the face value of credit default swaps outstanding in 2007, late 2007, was $50 trillion. That's the same amount, roughly speaking, of the value of all equity listed on Earth at that time. It's an insane amount that didn't, it was bets on bets on bets. And it was way bigger now than the financial market system had created a monster much bigger than the housing crisis, much bigger than simply a property crisis. And then nothing really happened. We had one or two bad years. There were banks that blew up, and then everything kind of continued. And you can see them starting to print money at that time. And so what happened? The inspiration for the book was, we're like in an industry that is we are working in an industry which is supposed to be the center. It's the brain. It's the brain that gives liquidity and capital to different market, to different parts of the body economic. So how is it possible that it keeps imploding on itself? And why do we not comment about this? Why are we not aware? And that was the inspiration, is what is going on? And what the thing that struck us, we write a journal, a Monocle quarterly journal. And the thing that really struck us is that the 4 largest banks in 2020 are Chinese banks. But China's economy is not the largest economy on earth. So where are the assets? And what is it going towards? So that was our insight when the Banker magazine released its numbers in July of 2020. We had just finished our journal called Zombies and Plague, which was a comment upon consciousness in times of COVID. And no one read it. And I was very frustrated. And I said, now we're going to write a book. We're going to figure out what's going on with these numbers.
And with those numbers, and even if you believe them coming out of China, which if you speak to most economists, most analysts, you've got to take any numbers that come out of China with a serious pinch of salt. I mean, they're non-performing loan numbers, and you address it in the book as well. Just very, very difficult to believe them. But also the financialization of the Chinese economy. It's supposed to be an industrial economy, and it is transitioning at the moment, but that certainly isn't borne out in the numbers that you go into in some detail. And what struck me about the book is it's, as a journalist, as a financial journalist, the level of detail and research that you've gone into is just phenomenal. And you do provide all of the notes and references at the back of the book. But I want to perhaps dial it back before we dive into China, because that is a fascinating story in and of itself. I think a central idea in the book is really that democracy is in decline. It's a failure, in essence, of liberal democracy that's led to this rise in authoritarianism. And I think China is the poster child of that. Can you just elaborate on that?
So 100%, Michael, is really distressing to witness over the last 30 years the erosion of the ideals and the reason for liberal democracy. It's almost as if people have forgotten the reason. So, there is an apex point where in the 1980s, we were listening to Madonna, and we assumed that the world was going to be free, and that countries that weren't free were going to nevertheless soon become free, because the great hand of Western civilization would guide all countries, to pinch a simile or metaphor, would guide all countries to the obvious outcome, which is that people should be free and should have a vote. And this was who knew that 1989 would be the apex point of liberal democracy when the Berlin Wall came down. So after that, you get China becomes, it adopts a kind of more open attitudes, state capitalism, and encourages growth. But it slowly, from about 2010, turns in on itself. And it can be almost correlated with its growth of debt. I think it becomes aware of its own debt, and that it's fed its growth with investment. And that, so China becomes increasingly authoritarian. I think it's correlated to the failure of their financial model, of their economic model. But at the same time, you've got us. By us, I mean liberal Democrat, people who are liberal, leaving Afghanistan. 20 years after we entered Afghanistan, for the reason of hunting down those, who attack us and who destroy our freedoms. So to watch South Sudan being taken over by a military dictatorship in the last month, to watch Turkey, basically completely interfere with their own financial system. Erdogan has gone mad. Now we don't need central bankers anymore. The president decides, on Turkish monetary policy. And then to watch 17 missionaries be abducted in Port-au-Prince in Haiti and being taken from one neighborhood to another, and they want $1 million for each of the missionaries. I don't hear any helicopters coming in to save those people. But 20, 30 years before, you've got Reagan entering Panama with airborne troops to extract Manuel Noriega, who was made to stand trial in the US, and who then spent the rest of his life in prison. And we invaded, I say we, talking about the Western liberal mindset, we invade Iraq incorrectly because we've lied to ourselves about weapons of mass destruction. But there was nevertheless a kind of movement in the last 10 years specifically away from liberal democracy and a tacit acceptance of authoritarianism. And you see it now getting momentum with Belarus. You see it with the South Sudan. You see it with Turkey. And there are fewer liberal democracies now than there were 30 years ago. And there are more authoritarian regimes. And I think what is the most disturbing part of it is that the political leadership in Western countries seems to just ignore it. And the average citizen seems to ignore it.
Well, there's no questioning, back to your point about China, of the Uyghur genocide in China at the moment. There's no questioning of China entering a global rules-based system, the WTO, the banking system as well, which is very highly regulated and governed according to the Basel Accord, and yet not playing by those rules, not playing to the same labor and trade rules and financial rules. And what is the link here then that you draw in the book to this rise in authoritarianism, but also the rise here of individuals, and we did see it in the build-up to the global financial crisis, who have lost faith in the kind of democratic ideals that I was certainly raised in the 1980s, and Thatcherism and Reaganism, Reaganomics, and their eschewing of finance. There's almost a cult-like, as you say, devotion to building a system of alternative means to trade outside of the traditional financial system. And that really is underpinning the rise of cryptocurrencies.
Yes, for me, they're all linked together, because the question was asked, if I could go back a step, the question I've asked is it a correlation, the rise of authoritarianism and the failure of the Western financial system and the loss of trust, or does one cause the other? Is there a causation or correlation? And then our publisher asked us this question, and I spent a long time thinking about it, and I've come to the conclusion that it's causal. The loss of trust causes us to care less as citizens about our political model, and we don't care as much about a model that's different from ours, and we forget our history. And that loss of trust was caused by greed, and it was caused by an extreme version of capitalism that took root in the 1980s and created this really kind of radical, extreme form of capitalism. And we're now seeing the behavior of Amazon and Facebook. We see now the big tech giants and how much power they have. This is now the natural conclusion of that greed. In terms of cryptocurrency, it's an indictment upon the human project. I mean, it's the most sad indictment upon the human project. I often get into these very hectic conversations with people who are acolytes of cryptocurrency because they're so invested. And it's like talking to a religious person when you're denying the existence of God. I mean, can be an extremely challenging conversation. So I try to get the conversation steered towards the technical aspects, because I try to explain to people just what is behind, the so-called cryptographic function.
And you use a good example. And so there are a couple of things. Obviously, the energy story is getting a lot more attention now. And you use this example of what it would take for a normal exchange to buy something from a grocer. And that grocer then having to send that around the world to be verified that that 10 Rand is real. And, what would that take in time?
It came to me as an image, because it's literally what's happening is you're burning carbon, you're burning energy to do something you already know the answer to. I mean, the way that proof of work works is that they're given the cryptographic function and you have to find the prime factors, and there's no way to find the prime factors because, of course, there's no solution to the distribution of primes, and the Riemann hypothesis 400 years ago is the closest we've got. There's no analytical solution to the distribution of primes through the number system. So what happens is you have to crunch, you have to get your computer onto a network of computers. Usually people work together and they join groups. So your computer would work overnight, and you will get 1/1,000,000th of one Bitcoin to help solve a problem we already know the answer to. And the way that proof of work works is that the authentication that makes it clear that this is an authentic transaction is because people in distributed places in decentralized finance, thousands of people have verified that this is in fact correct. So what we're doing is we're eschewing formal finance for reasons which we understand well, greed, financial crisis. But now we're creating a system where there's no trust at all. Yeah. And the work required to have a trustless system is for thousands of people to verify one thing, every single thing that occurs. So another interesting point, Michael, is the market value of cryptocurrency is about $3 trillion. Mm-hmm. But the market value of cryptocurrency that's actually on deposit or in loan, that's in a bank, that's in a is less than $100 billion. A very small, tiny fraction of this traded commodity asset currency is actually used for anything other than to trade the commodity asset currency that it is.
It's speculative.
Self-reflective.
It's speculative. And the other serious issue that you raise, and when we think about why we have a financial system that is so heavily regulated, the extreme laissez-faire free marketeers, the Ayn Randians they would say, but that's fine if you have dark pools. In a world where you could potentially be funding terrorism, in a world where financial flows have been abused to hide taxes that are fair and due away from those governments that are rightfully owed those taxes, what is the upshot of a world where we have a trustless system, where everything operates in dark pools? And that really made me sit up and think, because, if that is the future that we're heading to, we are heading for trouble, aren't we?
Yes, I think so. I think that the authorities, I think they've waited far too long. But so let's say that a cryptocurrency was a legitimate form of exchange and was not a waste of energy, and all of those other problems could go away. For one thing, it would need at a minimum to abide by the same anti-money laundering rules and counter-financing of terrorism rules and FICA rules and FATCA rules and automatic exchange rules that are imposed on all other financial systems. So, and there's reasons that for all these rules. It's because tax evasion is bad for the world. And so you need people to pay their taxes. Wealthy people tend to also evade tax. So that's FATCA and automatic exchange. The financing of terrorism is self-evident. If we want to slow down terrorism and to make it less sophisticated, we should make it more difficult for terrorists to receive weapons, to travel, to rent cars, and all of this is traceable through the CFT rules that are aligned worldwide under market conduct. And then anti-money laundering is a critical aspect of laws that are imposed on banks. So if someone argues to me or with me that we should lose our current financial system because it's a complete lack of trust, I would say that's a fair point. I mean, it has self-immolated repeatedly over the last 15 years. Okay, what's your alternative? I would still say that you must abide by the anti-money laundering rules and the counter-financing of terrorism. So what's happening is that the authorities are starting to wake up to this problem. And that's why you'll have the US contemplating rules for crypto. I think they're too slow, but I don't see any world in which they allow this to happen without rules being imposed. Personally, I don't see a future for crypto as a currency. I might be wrong about that, but certainly not without the rules.
And certainly not on the current rails and technology, to your earlier points. It's just far too inefficient, energy inefficient. I know they're working on proof of stake, and different technologies are coming up, but it still doesn't appear to be the most efficient way for us to conduct our affairs. Just as we have to wrap up because we are running out of time, Dave. There's so much to get through in the book, and as I said, it's detailed. I probably need an hour and a half with you. I want to come back to China because China is the big talking point, certainly in the South African market, because everyone's pension funds are linked through Naspers into Tencent, and what's going on? What is Xi Jinping up to? What is going on with the Chinese property sector? You address a lot of these issues, and you go into some real depth around the Chinese banking sector in particular. What conclusions do you arrive at in terms of the road and scenarios here for China?
I think the Chinese debt problem is much worse than it even appears on the Chinese bank's balance sheet. So Chinese banks have debt of 49, well, they've got assets, which is debt, of $49 trillion. So that's 300 to 400% GDP. It's an enormous load for a country with a $13 trillion GDP. Also, underneath that debt are AMCs, such as Huarong, which are holding, and
those are the asset management companies that take the non-performing loans off of their books just to quietly make them disappear.
Exactly, and they've been doing that, Michael, for 20 years, more than 20 years. So I see one scenario would be a Japanese-like outcome, where you have the lost decade, because they can't continue to fund their growth. Their growth is now declining. The rate of growth is declining. The working population is aging. There are now fewer workers in China each year than there used to be. People are culturally, embedded with one child rather than two children, and that problem will just slowly become the lost decade, or in Japan's case, the lost 2 decades. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that in order to contain the belligerence of the Chinese people, who are now, have been semi-westernized, I think Xi Jinping's going to become more hardcore. He's just become president for life under his own. That's the third, third, as you know.
After Mao and Deng,
yeah. He's behaving exactly like an autocratic, authoritarian leader of a population of 1.3 billion. And I think what we're going to see is more belligerence. And I'm afraid to say, I think we might see it with Taiwan. And I think we're going to see potential conflict. That would be the worst outcome, where you actually have, I haven't heard the word nuclear so much as in the last month.
Yeah. And why?
You hear the word a lot.
And why people are so worried about the South China Sea in particular. David, there is so much more that I'd like to talk to you about. So we're going to have you back on the show. I think we barely skimmed the surface, but it is all the time we have. David Buckham, CEO of Monocle, It's an excellently researched and detailed read for the beach this December. The book, as I said, it reads almost like you're reading something that's pure fiction. And you have to actually remind yourself that, hey, this is real life. This happened or is happening now. It's one of those, a real page turner, and it's available, I think, at all good bookstores, hey, exclusive, online. Go and look for it. The End of Money, David Buckham here on Business Watch. Thanks so much, or Business Talk, I should say. I'm not on TV. I'm doing this online. David, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was a great pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.